Damien's point of view.
Do it already. I can't stand the coldness radiating from you anymore, she said, pulling me out of my thoughts. My mind had drifted, stuck on the one word that lingered after everything she said. Trust. What the hell made her say that? Trust. From her? I let out a low chuckle, more to myself, at the absurdity of it. Trust was a concept I couldn't even entertain, yet hearing it from her did something strange to me. It left a faint buzz in my chest, a feeling I couldn't name. My attention shifted to her mate's wolf, who had risen and now stood protectively at her side, its piercing gaze fixed on me. Do I need to grab a knife from the kitchen and cut myself to get you started? Her sharp words pulled me back again. I looked down at her, taking in the determination etched across her face. She wasn't going to back down. With a quiet sigh, I reached for her and pulled her closer, my grip firm, but careful. It's going to sting, I warned, my voice low. I know, she replied softly, her fingers curling against me as she braced herself. I leaned toward her neck, the scent of her blood flooding my senses. My fangs slid out instinctively, sharpened by the steady rhythm of her heartbeat pounding beneath her skin. It was intoxicating, almost maddening. And then, I struck. The moment my fangs pierced her skin, her body tensed, and a soft gasp escaped her lips. The taste of her blood, warm, potent, and uniquely hers, rushed over my tongue like wildfire. My body shuddered violently, not in rejection, but in a chaotic surge of life. I stumbled back, barely holding on to her, as the warmth I'd lost flooded through me, like a dam breaking open. The air around me pulsed, crackling with energy, as my aura began to reform, piecing itself together after being shattered in the fight. The memory of the ghosts clawing at my soul from the outcast portal flashed before my eyes. Their icy whispers had drained me to the brink, their claws scraping at my essence, leaving behind a hollow shell. And Ralph's wolf, damned thing, its unknown energy had sapped the last of my strength, leaving me to teeter on the edge of oblivion. Kela clung to me, her fingers tightening against my chest, as if to ground herself. I could feel her heartbeat speeding up, erratic yet steadying itself with every passing moment. She wasn't afraid. I pulled back slightly, my fangs still buried in her neck, as I forced myself to remain in control. But the rush didn't stop. Her blood coursed through me like a forbidden elixir, awakening parts of me I thought had long since turned to ash. The trust she spoke of earlier wasn't just a word to her. She embodied it, laying it bare for me to accept or destroy. Her soft voice broke through the haze. Damien, are you okay? I froze. She was the one who should have been in pain, the one whose life should have been consumed by fear at this moment. And yet, she was asking about me. I withdrew slowly, careful not to take too much. The wounds on her neck closed almost instantly, a testament to the strength coursing through her veins. She sagged slightly in my arms. You're okay, I said, my voice rougher than I intended. I wasn't sure if it was meant to reassure her or myself. She blinked up at me, her eyes glassy but unwavering. Did it help? It did, I admitted, my tone softer now. Her lips curved into a faint smile, though her exhaustion was evident. Good, she murmured, her head tipping forward as she leaned into me before her eyes gave out. I carefully lifted her in my arms, her body feeling light but frail against me, like a delicate thread unraveling. Her head rested against my chest as I moved towards the bed, gently laying her down. I tucked the covers around her, smoothing the fabric over her still form, but just as I turned to leave, I felt a sudden firm tug on my shirt. She gripped it with surprising strength, her face contorting slightly in her sleep as she muttered, her voice laced with an eerie vulnerability. "Stay with me. I'm scared of these relentless haunting ghosts. I'm scared and tired of them." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Her words made my chest tighten, a strange knot forming in the pit of my stomach, and for a moment, I was unsure if she was speaking to me or to some unseen terror in her dreams. Her body trembled lightly, as if caught in the grip of something much darker than just exhaustion. "Please stay. Don't leave me. Stay with me." Tears began to slip from her closed eyelids, one trailing down her cheek, barely noticeable under the darkness. My heart squeezed painfully, a sensation I long lost. Was she speaking to me, or was she caught in some nightmare she couldn't escape? I looked down at her, her face pale, twisted in something far darker than fear. It was the type of dread that weighed down on her very soul, something far too familiar, but that I couldn't save her from. Not like this. From the corner of the room, Ralph's wolf watched, its body tense, its eyes filled with pain. A low whimper escaped its throat, and it pawed restlessly at the floor, clearly in distress. The wolf could feel her suffering. It was hurting because she was hurting, bound by the unseen connection between them. I hesitated, my hand hovering near her, wanting to untangle her grip on me but unsure if I should. But when I tried to move, she held on tighter, her fingers digging into my shirt like a lifeline. I cursed under my breath. "Fuck," I muttered. I didn't know what the hell I was doing here, with her like this. This wasn't part of the plan. I wasn't supposed to care. But the reality of the situation hit me all at once. She needed me. I had no other choice. My body had already betrayed me, and so had my mind. Reluctantly, I moved to her side, shifting carefully onto the bed next to her. She didn't loosen her hold, not even when I settled in beside her. I could feel the weight of her body beside me, the soft rise and fall of her chest. I could hear her breath, steadying slowly as if my presence was enough to ground her. I didn't want this. I didn't want to be here. Not with her. Not in the same bed with her. I hadn't been this close to another woman since Deirdre's death. The thought of sharing this space with someone else, especially someone else's woman, made my skin crawl. But I was trapped, bound by something I couldn't explain. The idea of abandoning her now was worse than the discomfort of staying. So, I stayed. A loud snore jolted me awake, the sound more violent than I'd ever imagined coming from a human. My eyes snapped open, and I found myself staring at the ceiling and realized it was already morning. And a late one. I groaned, raking my fingers through my hair in frustration. How the hell did I ever sleep this much? I muttered to myself, still half caught in the haze of sleep. Then I felt it, the weight pressing down on my chest. It took a moment for my brain to register, but then it hit me. Keela's leg was draped over me, her body sprawled in every direction, as if she had taken up more space than the bed allowed. I hissed under my breath, cursing under my breath, as I gently tried to remove her leg. Her snores grew louder in the process, as if she were blissfully unaware of how ridiculous she sounded. "Fucking hell," I muttered, trying to disentangle myself from her. I looked back at her, and I froze, my gaze unwillingly landing on her bare chest, exposed by the disheveled sheets. My breath hitched in my chest, and my stomach tightened with confusion. How the hell did she get her clothes off? With a quick motion, I turned away from her, grinding my teeth as I tried to push the thoughts from my mind. How the hell did you? I muttered under my breath, the question hanging in the air, but I didn't dare ask it out loud. I yanked the blanket back, over her form, covering her up, and slipped out of the bed. I looked down at her, frozen for a moment. Despite her ending up shirtless, she looked peaceful, even in her strange, sprawled-out position. Her body shifted with every breath, and every inch of her seemed to be claiming more space on the bed. It wasn't just her position. It was the loud snoring that echoed in my ears. My hand instinctively reached up to pinch the bridge of my nose as I sighed heavily. This wasn't how I expected to wake up. This wasn't how I wanted my life to be. Yet here I was. I walked out of the room and down the stairs, and as I entered the living room, Garby and Barbara greeted me good morning. I greeted back and headed outside where I knew Seth would already be. And there he was, along with Gerald. Seth looked worried, his brow furrowed, and he practically barreled over to me the second he spotted me. "King Draven," Seth said, his voice thick with concern. "Are you okay? Did the human's blood, did it work?" I stared at him for a moment before responding. "She has a name, Seth," I muttered. "She's called Kela." Seth blinked at me, but then nodded. "Okay. Did it work?" I exhaled sharply, feeling the tension in my chest loosen as I nodded. "Yes, it worked." Seth let out a breath of relief, his shoulders sagging. Gerald, standing behind him, did the same, as if the weight of the previous night had finally been lifted from them too. "I'm going back to the human world," I said, the weight of my words hanging heavily in the air. Seth and Gerald exchanged glances, both pausing as if the concept hadn't fully hit them yet. The energy from that portal, the one that nearly killed me, it's tied to the human world. It was spelled by a witch from their side. The only way to close that portal, to stop the outcasts from using it, is to find the same witch who opened it in the first place, and she's the only one who can close it. Seth blinked, clearly perplexed. "But how are you going to find the witch? That's one big world you're talking about." "Witches aren't like humans. Their energy doesn't blend in. It's easier for them to be tracked down. I've got a piece of the magic from the portal with me. That energy, it'll lead me to her. It's how I'll find her." Seth nodded, though I could tell he wasn't fully convinced. "And what about her?" he asked, motioning toward the house. "The human, Kela. Are you taking her with you? Because you'd better." Before he could finish his sentence, a blood-curdling scream tore through the house, unmistakably Kela's, filled with raw terror. The scream sent ice down my spine. Before I knew it, I was dashing up the stairs, each step heavier with dread. Seth and the others followed close behind, their footsteps echoing in the tense silence of the house. When I reached my room and shoved the door open, my senses went into overdrive. I scanned the room for any sign of danger. The windows were intact, no strange scents lingered in the air, and everything appeared undisturbed. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this place screamed threat. My eyes darted to Kela. She was leaned against the headboard, clutching the blanket tightly around her body, her eyes wide and darting between all of us. "What happened? Are you hurt?" Garby asked, his voice steady but concerned. It was a question I should have asked, but deep down, I already knew the answer. Kela's fingers twisted into the blanket, and she let out a shaky breath before forcing an awkward smile. "Not really," she said awkwardly, her voice shaky. "I'm good. She trailed off, exhaling sharply before glancing at me. "I need to talk to him. Only him." Her words hung in the air, heavy and pointed. She motioned toward me, her fingers trembling slightly. I felt the weight of every gaze shift to me, 1,000 unspoken questions swirling in their eyes. Seth lingered by the door, his brow furrowed as he stared between me and Kela, his expression darkening with suspicion. Garby and Barbara exchanged a glance, their hesitation lasting only a moment, before Barbara grabbed Garby's arm, pulling her toward the door. Gerald followed suit, though his movements were slower, as if reluctant to leave. Seth, however, didn't budge immediately. His gaze lingered on me, sharp and questioning, before it flicked back to Kela. I didn't need to read minds to know what he was thinking. "Leave us," I said firmly, my tone leaving no room for argument. His eyes narrowed, but after a beat, he nodded and turned on his heel, walking out and closing the door behind him. I exhaled heavily, running a hand down my face before looking at Kela. "What was that about?" I asked, my voice quieter now, but still laced with authority. She shifted uncomfortably on the bed, still clutching the blanket to her chest, like it was a lifeline. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion as she finally found her voice, though it came out sharp and biting. "What happened? Why am I in your bed?" she demanded, her grip on the blanket tightening. "What did you do to me? Did we? Are you telling me you don't remember?" I cut her off, my tone harsher than intended, the frustration bubbling beneath my calm exterior. Her expression darkened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I shouldn't have asked if I remembered this part of waking up in your bed," she snapped, her voice laced with anger. I let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through my hair, trying to keep my composure. "Nothing happened," I said firmly, meeting her glare head-on. "Trust me, you slept here alone." Her eyes narrowed further, searching my face for any sign of deceit. "And about you ending up naked," I continued, my voice measured but steady. "I don't know. I didn't touch you, Kela." She blinked, her anger momentarily giving way to confusion before it flared back up again. I exhaled sharply, resisting the urge to roll my eyes. "Get something to eat," I said, my tone clipped but not unkind. "We're going to the human world." Her eyes widened, and she moved to the edge of the bed, still gripping the heavy blanket. "Are you serious?" she asked, disbelief etched into her expression. As she tried to step forward, she tumbled down onto the floor in an ungraceful heap. "I'm fine," she said quickly, glaring at me from the floor, even though I hadn't made a step. "I don't need help." I shook my head, muttering under my breath as I turned and walked out, leaving her to deal with herself. Once outside, a sharp, acrid scent hit. Death. Human death. But this time, it was laced with something else. Aaron's scent. My entire body tensed as my senses sharpened. Without another word, I disappeared into the foggy air, dashing toward the source of the stench. The trail led me to a remote base near the edge of the woods. The scene that greeted me made my blood run cold. The moment I landed, Seth appeared beside me. "You still have some answers to my questions," Seth said, his tone cold. "Did you sleep with her?" I brushed him off, my attention fixed on the scene ahead, where Aaron was holding a human, a teen boy still in his school uniform, dangling in the air as if he were a toy. Aaron's fangs hovered near the boy's neck, his posture almost mocking, as though he knew I was watching and was daring me to act. And it wasn't just one boy. There were more. Many more students scattered across the ground, their lifeless faces and bloodied uniforms painting a grim picture. What a fucking scumbag, I snarled, the image making my chest tighten. Are you even listening to me? Seth snapped, his voice cutting through my mounting rage. Of course, it's not forbidden, I replied absent-mindedly, my gaze locked on Aaron. Seth hissed, clearly frustrated but utterly unfazed by the scene unfolding in front of us. His only concern seemed to be whether I had slept with Kela or not. I gritted my teeth as Aaron's fangs finally sank into the boy's neck, the sickening sound of piercing flesh echoing in my ears. That was it. I launched myself forward, slamming into Aaron with enough force to make him release the boy. The teen crumpled to the ground, gasping for breath, as I stood over him, my body brimming with fury. I gripped Aaron by his collar, my fury boiling, the need to end this madness consuming me. Without hesitation, I used my magic, focusing on the raw energy coursing through my veins. My power surged outward, rippling through the air and channeled it into his body, breaking and tearing him down from within. Aaron groaned in pain, his body spasming as the power ravaged him, twisting and fracturing. His screams were raw, but they only fueled my anger further. He deserved worse. I watched as he groaned, struggling against the magic that consumed him. To the people you killed, I spat, my voice cold as ice. You shouldn't have included kids, more importantly students. That was out of line. Aaron's body quivered, but then, to my horror, he suddenly burst into laughter. The sound grated against my senses, sharp and mocking, like nails on a chalkboard. What's so funny about that? I demanded, my teeth grinding in frustration. His laughter only grew louder, more deranged, and I could feel it in my mind. The echoing sound wasn't coming from Aaron. It was coming from within my own head, a mocking, twisted voice that slithered through my thoughts. I froze. Something shifted in the air, and I felt it. The subtle change in the very fabric of reality around me. My eyes narrowed, honing in on the truth that had evaded me just moments before. It wasn't Aaron. The man I had just killed wasn't him. He was one of my people. A wave of realization hit me, sharp and cold, as I released the lifeless body. I looked around, my heart sinking. The forest, the distant echoes of human death, the students, all gone. The familiar surroundings were replaced with cold, oppressive stone. The walls surrounding me weren't the trees. They were the red stones of the castle. The reality of it slammed into me all at once. I wasn't in the forest anymore. I was alone, inside the red castle, standing in the heart of my own domain, the ruling chamber that had once felt so familiar, now a place of disorienting isolation. But the real question lingered. How had I been brought here, without even realizing it? The oppressive silence of the red castle bore down on me, each heartbeat echoing in my ears like the toll of a bell. My breaths were shallow as I tried to piece together what had just happened. One moment, I had been in the forest, confronting Aaron, or what I thought was him, and now I stood here, trapped in my domain. I reached out with my senses, probing for any signs of life, magic, or danger. The air crackled faintly, a telltale sign of a powerful spell. It wasn't my magic. It was something foreign, invasive, and far stronger than I'd anticipated. My jaw clenched as I realized just how badly I'd been played. The laughter from earlier still echoed faintly in my mind, sending a chill through me. It wasn't Aaron's voice now, nor was it the voice of anyone I recognized. It was distorted, layered with malice, a voice meant to unsettle and provoke. Draven, the monarch, the voice intoned, each word laced with a sinister melody that reverberated in the stillness. It didn't echo through the air like a normal sound. Instead, it seeped into my very being, weaving through me like a venomous serpent. The source wasn't visible, yet I felt its origin, the throne itself. Its presence pressed against my mind, dark and unyielding, beckoning me with an eerie familiarity. The voice continued, a soft whisper at first, then rising in cadence, its sinister harmony wrapping around my consciousness like silken chains. The throne, my throne, seemed alive, pulsing with an ancient energy that I had long abandoned and nearly forgotten. I felt my steps falter, the sharp edges of reality dulling around me. The shadows in the chamber began to ripple, stretching and swaying as though dancing to an unseen rhythm. And then, the chanting began. Nerat vi mortem, sanguis vi dominus, servitum aeternum. Asterisk. The words slithered through the air, their weight dragging at my senses. They were old, far older than me, older than any creature I had ever known. Each syllable carried the taste of blood and the weight of eternity. Venare lux, obscurum regnare, nostra vita, tua potestas. Asterisk. The voices multiplied, layered and overlapped, weaving a spell of compulsion and despair. They spoke of power, of blood, of servitude. Yet there was a hunger in their tone, a desire to consume, to devour. I tried to step back, to turn away, but my body betrayed me. My legs moved forward of their own accord, drawn to the throne as though 1,000 invisible hands were pulling me. The closer I got, the louder the chants grew, resonating in my skull. Sanguinem vocamus, animam vindicamus, rede Draven immortalem regem. Asterisk. The chant echoed, twisting and snarling like a living entity. My chest tightened, my head throbbing. I reached the throne, my fingers brushing against the cold stone. The instant my skin made contact, a surge of power slammed into me. It wasn't the usual surge I was accustomed to, but a raw, ancient force that flooded every inch of my being. My vision blurred, the room spinning in dark hues of crimson and black. Nunc revenias, nunc regnis, vitam damus, mortem sumimus. Asterisk. The chant had become a roar, a tidal wave of sound that drowned out every thought, every sense of self. The throne called to me, demanded me, whispered promises of unparalleled strength and dominion. And I fell. Not physically, but into a trance, a deep, consuming abyss. The voices spiraled through me, guiding my mind into the void. Images began to flash before me, a sea of blood under a moonless sky, the faces of those I had ruled, their eyes hollow and their screams silent. Rex vampirorum, dominus umbrarum, tua est vita nostra, tua est anima nostra. Asterisk. I couldn't tell if I was still standing, or if I had already sunk into the depths of the throne. It felt as though my dead soul was being peeled away, layer by layer, and yet I didn't resist. I couldn't resist. The throne's pull grew unbearable, like iron chains digging into my skin. I summoned my magic, my most potent spells, the essence of my being, but each attempt splintered into fragments against the relentless force. Flames sparked in my palms, only to be extinguished in an instant. Shadows bent to my will, surging forward to sever the invisible bonds. but they were swallowed by the darkness emanating from the throne itself. My breathing turned ragged. The fear I hadn't felt in centuries surged to the surface, raw and suffocating. I wasn't just afraid of the power. No, this was deeper. I was terrified of what it would make me. The old Draven. The tyrant. The monster. If I sat on that throne, if I allowed it to consume me, it wouldn't just be my ruin. It would be the ruin of everything I'd fought so hard to protect. My people, who still whispered my name with trembling reverence, would burn under its rage. No one would be spared. "Stop this," I hissed through clenched teeth, clawing at the edges of my mind for something, anything, to anchor me. Then, like a fleeting flame in the dark, an image surfaced. Deirdre. Her face was soft and warm, her smile a balm against the storm raging inside me. For a moment, her memory steadied me. I clung to it, her name forming on my lips. But the throne's pull didn't waver. The chant changed, dark and seductive, twisting her memory into something grotesque. The warmth faded, replaced with icy despair. And then, against my will, another name came to me. Kela. I hadn't meant to think of her, but her face rose unbidden, luminous and defiant, her sharp gaze slicing through the shadows like a blade, and when her name slipped past my lips, barely audible, the effect was immediate. The energy around me erupted. The pull reversed, and I was yanked backwards, as if the throne itself recoiled from her name. The impact hit like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. My chest heaved as I gasped for breath, my heart hammering in disarray. I opened my eyes, dazed, my surroundings coming into focus. No stone walls, no throne. The forest. I was back in the forest where this began. The ground beneath me was damp with dew. My vision swam, blurring Seth's figure standing before me. His lips were moving, his voice faint like an echo in a distant room. I blinked hard, trying to steady my focus. Seth's voice sharpened. "Hear me? Are you even listening, Draven?" I struggled to respond, the pounding in my head drowning out his words. But then, one word jolted me like a strike of lightning. Kela. The name shattered the fog in my mind, yanking me back to full awareness. My eyes snapped to Seth, whose gaze burned with intensity. "Let's head back to the house," I muttered, my voice strained and thin. The words barely left my lips before I turned, already moving to vanish into the air. But as my foot lifted to take that first step, an overwhelming pull gripped me. A dark, suffocating force that made the world around me blur, and before I could catch my breath, everything went weightless. The forest, the voices, all of it dissolved into the depths of nothingness. Then, without warning, the world snapped back into place. I opened my eyes, and everything was different, warmer, familiar. I was standing in a room I hadn't seen in years. In our room. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The faint scent of lavender hung in the air, mingling with the warmth of sunlight spilling through the window. And there she was. Deirdre. My heart stopped. She was at the window, her back to me, auburn hair cascading over her shoulders. She moved with that familiar grace, her hands gently stacking books on a shelf. Her voice, soft and serene, filled the space as though it had never left. She was speaking something about magic, balance, her hands moving in a way I recognized all too well, guiding me, reminding me how to control what she had given me so long ago. "Deirdre," I whispered, my voice barely audible, as though saying her name too loud would shatter her image. She turned at the sound, and I felt my knees weaken. Those piercing, beautiful green eyes, so full of life, met mine, and her smile. It was the same one that had always undone me, warm and radiant. "Is everything all right, husband?" she asked, her voice smooth and sweet, cutting through the haze of disbelief like sunlight through mist. Tears burned at the corners of my eyes, the pressure in my chest unbearable. My feet carried me forward before I even realized I was moving. She didn't disappear, didn't vanish as I feared she might. When I reached her, she was there, solid, warm, real. My hands trembled as I pulled her into my arms, clutching her as if I could make this moment to last forever. Her scent was still the same, lavender, and something magically hers. Her body fit perfectly against mine, and I felt the softness of her hands as they wrapped around me, her fingers stroking my back with the tenderness only she possessed. "What has made my strong husband so emotional all of a sudden?" she teased lightly, though her voice was laced with concern. I buried my face in her shoulder, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I've had a long dream," I choked out. "A terrible dream. And in it, I lost you. You were gone, Deirdre. You were gone. Forever." Her voice was a whisper in my ear. "A dream, love. Just a dream. I'm here now, aren't I? Right here with you." The words eased something inside me, yet doubt coiled in the back of my mind. This moment, this warmth, this life, felt too perfect, too fragile. I held her tighter, terrified that if I let go, she'd slip away again into the abyss of memory and pain.
Kelah's POV.
The moment Damien closed the door, I let out a long, shaky breath, the tension in my chest finally easing. "That was embarrassing," I muttered under my breath, slumping against the edge of the bed. My body felt like it had been wrung out, my nerves still buzzing from his presence. I stayed there for a moment, letting my heart beat slow before deciding it was time to pull myself together. With a sigh, I pushed myself off the floor, only to feel the cursed blanket wrap itself around my legs. Before I could stop it, gravity had its way, and I tumbled back down, landing hard and awkwardly on my face. "Holy shit," I hissed, tasting blood on the tip of my tongue where I'd bitten it during the fall. I groaned, untangling myself from the blanket. The sting in my forehead added to the indignity of the moment. Finally freeing myself from the blanket, I stumbled to the bathroom. Flipping on the light, I leaned over the sink and stared into the mirror. My reflection wasn't as bad as I feared, just a small swelling on my forehead where I'd hit the floor. "Great," I muttered sarcastically, touching the tender spot with a wince. As I tilted my head to get a better look, my gaze dropped to my bare chest, and I froze. For a moment, my mind flickered back to a memory, vivid and bittersweet. A heavy sigh escaped me as realization set in. I might have taken off my blouse, thinking, out of habit, that I was still breastfeeding Evan. A sad, wistful smile crept onto my face as the memory unfurled. The late nights when I would hold him close, his small, warm body nestled against mine as I nursed him. The way his tiny fingers would curl around mine, his soft breathing a balm to my soul. Tears pricked at my eyes, and before I could stop them, they spilled over, hot and unrelenting. "I miss you, baby," I whispered, my voice breaking as I ran my fingers over the edge of the sink and trying to ground myself. The pain was a sharp, aching hole in my chest, one that no amount of time or distraction seemed to fill. Swallowing hard, I dried my tears with trembling fingers. There was no time to lose myself in grief right now, not with everything happening. I needed to hold it together. I slipped back into the bedroom and pulled my blouse over my head, smoothing the fabric down. I straightened the bed, tucking the sheets neatly before stepping back to examine my work. Satisfied, I squared my shoulders, pushed the door open, and walked out. Downstairs, the rich aroma of coffee greeted me as I stepped into the kitchen. Barbara sat at the counter, sipping from a glass cup with a calm air, while Garby stood nearby, her posture rigid and watchful. Both turned toward me as I entered. Good morning, I said, making my way to the coffee pot without waiting for a response. I poured myself a cup, the warmth seeping through the ceramic mug, grounding me further. Their silence hung heavy in the air, a tangible thing, and I could feel their gazes drilling into my back. When I turned to face them, my suspicion was confirmed. Both were looking at me like they wanted to ask something but weren't sure how to start. If this awkwardness is about me waking up in Damien's bed, I said dryly, raising an eyebrow, slip it out of your heads. It's not what it looked like. All right? Barbara blinked and looked away, her lips twitching as if suppressing a smile, but Garby's expression just turned stony. Shrugging, I took my cup and moved to the couch in the living room, setting it down before sinking into the cushions. Moments later, Garby followed, sitting across from me with her piercing gaze locked on me. She said nothing, which was even more unsettling than the silence in the kitchen. I took a tentative sip of the coffee and nearly winced. Bitter. Awful. Still, I swallowed it down and set the cup aside, finally addressing her. Why are you staring at me like that? Her eyes narrowed slightly, and when she spoke, her voice carried a hint of disapproval. If you'd like us to continue to be friends, please put respect on King Draven's name. I blinked at her, caught off guard by the unexpected admonishment. A chuckle escaped my lips, light but tinged with incredulity. Isn't that his name, though? Why does everyone get so pissed off when I say it? That's the name I've known since I met him, and he's never shown me any... Garby's low growl cut me off, a guttural sound that vibrated through the room and made my stomach clench. Her eyes flashed with irritation. All right, fine, I said quickly, holding up my hands in mock surrender. I get it. I'm sorry for disrespecting your king. It won't happen again. Her features softened and the tension in her shoulders eased, but I could tell she was still wary. I chuckled again, the sound more amused this time. Garby was fiercely loyal. I had to give her that. I would like to meet with your friends one last time, I said after a beat, my tone more serious now. Because I'm going back to the human world. Garby's reaction was instantaneous. She darted to my side, her eyes wide with shock. Really? So soon? I nodded, feeling the weight of the decision settle over me. It's what your king told me. Garby's frown deepened, and a shadow of sadness crept across her face. It was subtle but unmistakable, a crack in her usually stoic demeanor. What's with that face? I asked softly, tilting my head as I studied her. She hesitated, her eyes flickering with emotion before she spoke. We were just starting to get to know each other, and now... You're leaving. Her words carried a weight that tugged at something in me. I smiled despite myself, touched by her honesty and the warmth she'd shown me. For all her sharp edges and stern loyalty, Garby had become something of a friend to me in this place. Sweet, in her own unique way. I already knew I would miss her and, of course, my other new friends, once I was gone. I reached out and draped an arm over her shoulder in a small gesture of comfort. She stiffened for a moment before relaxing slightly, leaning into the contact. I feel the same, I said honestly, but still, this isn't my world, Garby. I don't belong here. Let's not waste any more time, I said, standing up abruptly. Let's go meet up with the others. I don't want to leave without saying goodbye. I grabbed the unfinished cup of coffee, intending to return it to the kitchen, but before I could take another step, a sudden jolt of energy hit me like a punch to the chest. I gasped as a wave of gravity seemed to pull me down, throwing me off balance. The cup of coffee slipped from my hand, crashing to the floor, coffee splattering in all directions. Everything happened so fast. I didn't have time to register it. My knees buckled beneath me and I collapsed to the floor, my vision blurring. My head spun, the sounds of Barbara and Garby's frantic voices distant, as though they were speaking to me from miles away. Their words faded in and out like static on an old radio. Kela! Barbara's voice broke through the fog, but it was far away, strained with worry. I wanted to respond, to tell them I was fine, but I couldn't make my mouth move. It felt like I was sinking into something thick, like my body was being weighed down by a force beyond my control. Then, a sharp, biting pain radiated from my neck. My fingers flew to the spot, but it was like my skin was sizzling, an electric sting pulsing beneath the surface. I winced, my eyes watering from the intensity of the sensation, and I could feel the pounding in my head, like someone was hammering inside my skull. My vision flickered, then swam before me. What was happening to me? I tried to breathe, tried to ground myself, but everything was spinning too fast. The pain was unbearable, almost overwhelming. My chest ached as I struggled to focus, to hold on to consciousness. But the room around me faded, the edges blurring into darkness. I felt my strength slip away, like the life force was being drained from me in slow, agonizing waves. I heard Garby's voice again, frantic now, but it was muffled, distant, as though I was hearing her from underwater. The last thing I could remember before everything went black was the overwhelming sense of falling, and the feeling that something deep inside me was changing. I gasped loudly, my body jolting upright as though I'd just awoken from a terrible nightmare. My chest heaved and I clutched the spot over my heart, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The air felt different, heavier somehow, but I was alive. Barbara and Garby were kneeling by my side, their faces pale with terror. "Are you all right?" they asked in unison, their voices shaky. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. Something felt different. No, I felt different. I stared at my hands, flexing my fingers as if trying to confirm they still belonged to me. There was a strange lightness coursing through me, but at the same time a grounding familiarity. It was like a layer of static had been peeled away. I started, and stopped, unsure of how to describe what I was feeling. My mind raced. I'm human, I know that. But ever since meeting Damien again, I've felt off. Strange. My body hasn't felt entirely like my own, like I wasn't fully human anymore. The realization hit me, sharp and clear, but now I feel like my old self again. Like the real me. Barbara's voice snapped me back to the moment. "Kela?" she said cautiously. "Are you okay?" I looked at both of them, their concern etched in every line of their faces. Without thinking, I asked aloud as if they held the answers. What just happened to me? Garby's frown deepened. Her eyes flickered to my neck, and her expression grew hesitant, almost afraid. She leaned in closer, staring at the spot I'd instinctively grabbed earlier. "The mark," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The mark is gone. It's disappeared." I froze. My fingers flew to my neck, touching the place where Damien's mark had been, the one that had been a constant reminder of him and everything that came with it. It was smooth now, unblemished. No trace of the mark remained. Gone, just like that. I stared at Garby, disbelief and confusion swirling in my mind. "How is that possible?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. I pushed myself up, my legs feeling too light, like they weren't quite holding me properly. The floor beneath me seemed distant, and for a split second, I thought I might collapse again. But before I could fall, Barbara was there, her hand steadying me. "Kela, take it easy," she said, her voice filled with concern. I nodded, barely registering her words as I shook off her hold, moving with urgency toward the stairs. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't make sense of what was happening. The need to see myself in the mirror, to make sure what I was feeling was real, overpowered any rational thought. I rushed upstairs, nearly tripping as I pushed through the bedroom door. The bathroom mirror welcomed me, and I stood frozen before it, my breath catching in my throat. I turned my head to the side and stared at the spot where Damien's bite mark had once been. It was gone. The smooth skin beneath my fingers mocked me, a chilling emptiness where the mark used to be. I reached up, scratching at the spot instinctively, hoping that maybe I'd just imagined it. But when I pulled my hand away, the skin remained perfectly smooth. No mark, no trace, nothing. "What happened?" I whispered to the empty room, my voice shaking. "Why is it gone?" My eyes darted to the other side of my neck, where Ralph's mark was still very much present, a dark reminder of my connection to him. The contrast between the two was jarring. Damien's mark had vanished, but Ralph's still lingered like a brand. Confusion clouded my mind, my thoughts spiraling. I turned back toward the mirror, my mind struggling to piece together any logical explanation. The questions piled up faster than I could process them. I whispered again, my voice trembling with fear. Could something have happened to Damien? Could he be in trouble, or worse, dead? The thought of Damien being in trouble gnawed at me, and the room seemed to grow colder as the fear sank in. My heart raced, and before I could spiral further into panic, Barbara's voice broke through from the bedroom. Kela, are you all right? She called, her voice tinged with worry. Moments later, she appeared in the bathroom doorway, her gaze sweeping over me with concern. I spun around to face her, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I think something bad has happened. The sudden raised voices from downstairs cut me off, and the distinct mention of King Draven from a male voice sent a chill down my spine. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I bolted out of the bathroom, accidentally knocking into Barbara's shoulder as I rushed past her. When I reached the living room, my heart sank. There he was, Damien, laid out on the couch, unconscious. Seth stood by his side along with another man I didn't recognize. Panic gripped me as I stepped closer. What happened to him? I asked, my voice trembling as I moved toward Damien. Before I could reach him, Seth's hand shot out, grabbing my wrist with a force that made me wince in pain. Don't get close to him, he said, his tone as hard as his grip. I stared at him, shocked by his sudden hostility. Why? I demanded, struggling against his hold. You don't have that right, Seth snapped, his voice dripping with disdain. Anger flared in me, and with a sharp tug, I broke free, but not without stumbling back and hitting the floor. Pain flared in my tailbone, but I ignored it, pushing myself up quickly. At least tell me what happened, I yelled, my voice rising with desperation. I have the right to know! Seth turned away from me, his focus back on Damien. My heart pounded as I noticed dark veins spreading across Damien's face and down his neck, stark against his pale skin. Whatever was happening to him was unnatural, terrifying. Holy shit, Seth whispered, his face paling as he stared at Damien. The other man stepped back, his hand covering his mouth, equally horrified. It's happening, the stranger said in a hushed, trembling voice. Seth didn't waste another second. I need to take him to the hills, he said urgently, his tone brooking no argument. He bent down, lifting Damien's upper body, while the other man grabbed his legs. Before I could ask any more questions or demand answers, they disappeared, just like that, into thin air, leaving nothing behind but a heavy, suffocating silence. Garby staggered backwards, her face ashen with fear. I could see the panic in her eyes, the uncertainty that mirrored the cold terror creeping through me. Without a word, I rushed to her, grabbing her hand tightly. Garby, I said, my voice trembling. You know what's happening with Damien? King Draven, right? Tell me, what happened? What is going on? What were those black veins? Her eyes flickered to Damien's empty spot on the couch, her expression darkening with a mix of dread and helplessness. Slowly, she spoke, her voice low. King Draven is turning back to the old evil, ruthless king he was 600 years ago. The weight of her words hit me like a brick. The coldness of that thought settled into my bones. Turning back? I echoed, confused. But why? What happened to him? Garby wiggled her hand free from mine, moving toward the door, her voice cracked with urgency. No, we have to do something. He can't turn back to that. He can't become that monster again. Before I could process it, she started to vanish, the air around her warping as she moved. But in a panic, I reached out, grabbing her wrist desperately. I'm coming with you, please, I begged, my grip tightening around her hand. Garby's face softened, but her gaze was filled with reluctant concern. Kela, if my dad kills you, it's not on me, she warned in a bitter tone. I didn't hesitate. I'm not afraid of your father, I said, my voice firm despite the fear clawing at my chest. I need to help him. I have to. Garby paused, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, she nodded, slowly, her face set with determination. All right, but you need to be prepared. This isn't going to be easy. I swallowed hard, steeling myself for whatever came next. I don't care, I'll do whatever it takes. I clung to Garby, my fingers digging into her arm as we rushed through the air. The cold wind whipped against my skin, my heart pounding in my chest. Each beat seemed to echo the fear and uncertainty swirling inside me. I had no idea what was happening to Damien, but I knew it wasn't good. And the black veins spreading across his skin were a sign of something worse. Before I knew it, we landed, the hills stretching before us. The cabin came into view, familiar and unsettling. Garby let go of my arm, stepping toward the door, and I followed her in a daze, my mind racing. "Is he inside here?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Garby's response was quick, almost too quick. "No," she said, rushing into one of the rooms, the door slamming behind her. And soon after, she returned with the matching fur sweater and boots and handed them to me. "It's cold out here," she said, her voice carrying a weight I didn't understand. I didn't waste any time, pulling the sweater on and slipping the boots over my bare feet. Despite the warmth of the clothing, the chill in the air seemed to seep right into my bones. I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me, the fear for Damien, the uncertainty of what was happening to him, and the sheer panic that was beginning to claw at my insides. "Where is he?" I demanded. My voice sounded more desperate than I wanted it to. Garby didn't look at me as she spoke. "He was taken to the tower." The tower. The words felt heavy in my mouth, like a dead weight. "Then let's go there." My pulse quickened. I couldn't just stand here. Not while Damien was out there, slipping further into darkness. Garby stopped me before I could take a step toward the door, her hand gripping my arm. "No," she said firmly. "We have to wait here. I'm not allowed to go near that tower." I froze. "What? Why not?" I shook my head, my confusion mingling with frustration. "He's in danger. We have to help him. We can't just sit here." Garby avoided my gaze, her jaw tight. "The tower is sacred," she said quietly, her voice laced with an unspoken fear. "Only a few people can enter. I'm not one of them. If I try to get close to it, my father will punish me." A lump formed in my throat, my frustration threatening to boil over. "So that's it? We just wait? While he's out there, dying, and we sit here, powerless?" My voice cracked, the raw emotion spilling out before I could stop it. Garby's voice was sharp, almost defensive as she stepped back, her hands raised in frustration. "What are you going to do about it, Kela? Are you saying you're going to heal him from turning? Kela, you said it yourself that you don't belong here." Her gaze hardened, but there was something else in her eyes, something I couldn't quite place. "Kela, you're human, not a vampire. And the man you want to see, whom you can't even help, is a vampire king who has lived for more than 1,000 years. She shook her head, her tone softening but still firm. "If you want to know about his news, you have to wait here, patiently." Her words hit me like a slap to the face. I wanted to argue, to shout that I didn't care what I was or what I wasn't, but her words rang with the bitter truth I didn't want to face. I took a step back, my chest tightening. I wasn't like them. I didn't belong here. I wasn't meant to be part of this world. I had been swept up in it all, Damien, the power, the vampires, and everything that had come with it. But I was still human, wasn't I? Still bound by the rules of this world, the same rules that left me powerless to help him. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat threatening to choke me. Garby continued, her voice softer now, but there was a certain hardness to her words that made me feel small. "I know it's hard, Kela. I don't want him to change back either. But you have to understand, there are things in this world you can't change. Not with your human hands." I clenched my fists, her words cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. I hated feeling powerless. I hated standing still while Damien was slipping further away. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to act, to do something, anything, but Garby's words were a harsh reminder of my limits. I turned away from her, my chest heaving as I struggled to calm the storm inside me. My mind whirled with thoughts of Damien, of those black veins crawling across his skin. What was I even doing here? How could I possibly help? But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself to step back, to listen to reason, a small, stubborn part of me refused. I couldn't just wait. I couldn't just accept that there was nothing I could do. I turned back to Garby, determination hardening my voice. "You might think I can't help," I said. my voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside me. But I have to try. Your king. He's not just some vampire to me. He saved me and protected me, even when he didn't have to. I owe him. Garby's expression softened for a moment, but she quickly masked it with a resigned sigh. Kela, you don't understand the danger you're walking into. If you defy my father— I don't care, I snapped, cutting her off. I don't care what your father thinks or what rules I'm breaking. If I don't do something, I'll regret it for the rest of my life. Garby's eyes flashed with irritation as she crossed her arms tightly over her chest. All right, Kela, she snapped, her tone sharp enough to cut through the cold air. I agree. Let's say you really want to help King Draven. How are you exactly planning on doing that, huh? Tell me, how? Her question hit me like a slap, stopping me in my tracks. My mind went blank. My heart pounded painfully in my chest as I opened my mouth to respond, only to find that I had nothing. No plan, no powers, no mark linking me to Damien anymore. Just nothing. Garby didn't wait for me to find my footing. Exactly, you don't know. So just stay put and wait for my father to bring any news. Or better yet, go back to King Draven's house and wait there. After all, your being here won't exactly make my father happy. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms as anger flared inside me. I was now getting tired. Tired of Garby throwing her father into every conversation like his presence was the only thing that mattered. I'm not here for your father, Garby, I said sharply, my eyes narrowing as I met her gaze. I'm here for your king, King Draven. Whether your father approves or not, I'm not leaving until I know he's okay. Garby raked her hands through her hair, her frustration palpable as she grumbled. I can't believe you. Why are you so stubborn? Are all humans this impossible? I didn't dignify her question with a response. Instead, I shot her a pointed look before finding the nearest chair and settling into it. I crossed my legs, leaning back as if to make it clear I wasn't going anywhere. I'm waiting here, I said firmly, my tone leaving no room for argument. Garby let out a loud, exasperated breath, throwing her hands up in defeat. Fine, she snapped. Do whatever you want. If it's death you're after, so be it. She dropped into a seat of her own, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, glaring at the floor as though it had personally offended her. The door to the room flew open with a loud bang, and Seth stormed in like a violent storm, his fiery gaze locking onto me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. His eyes, dark and smoking with death, bore into me as if I were his mortal enemy. Before I could even process his presence, Seth moved in a blur. His large hand gripped the front of the sweater I was wearing, lifting me off the ground as though I weighed nothing. What the hell are you doing here? He snarled, his voice a deep, guttural growl. What business do you have here? I struggled against his grip, my feet dangling in the air, panic coursing through me. His sheer hatred was palpable, radiating from him in waves. I stared into his face, searching for even a flicker of reason, but all I saw was a venomous disdain. My voice came out sharp and defiant, despite the fear coiling in my chest. I came to see Damien, for Christ's sake, I snapped. His expression darkened further, and his grip tightened. In a blink, he hurled me across the room. Pain exploded in my back and side as I collided with the wooden wall, the impact rattling through my bones. I crumpled to the floor with a hard thud, a groan escaping my lips as I arched my body in pain. Before I could recover, Seth was on me again, his hand twisting in my hair as he yanked me to my feet. A sickening growl rumbled from his chest, his sharp fangs bared so close to my neck I could feel the chill of his breath. I don't like you, woman, he spat. The idea of you in the underworld disgusts me. Watching you stand anywhere near my king makes my skin crawl, but I bear it only because of him. Anger surged through my pain. His hatred for me was irrational, burning without reason. The words escaped my lips before I could stop them. Are you in love with him or what? Is that it? Are you jealous? His growl grew deeper, vibrating in my chest like a warning bell. His fangs hovered over my neck and I shut my eyes, bracing for the inevitable bite, but it didn't come. Instead, his hand released my hair, and a sharp, resounding slap cracked across my cheek. The force sent me stumbling to the floor, and my vision blurred as stars danced across my eyes. The sting burned hot and sharp, a reminder of just how dangerous this man could be. Seth's growl reverberated through the room, his rage barely contained. He pointed a clawed finger at his daughter. "Take her back, Garby, and don't you ever bring her here again." I stumbled upright, my body aching from the earlier impact, but my resolve burning stronger than ever. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, my voice steady despite the fire in my cheek and the tremor in my limbs. "Not without seeing your king first. I need to know how he is, and how I can possibly help." Seth pressed his fingers to his temples, exhaling sharply as though trying to temper the inferno raging within him. When he finally looked at me, his eyes blazed with forcefully contained anger. "Do you really want to die? In my hands?" he said, his voice low and menacing. Garby reached for my hand, her own trembling as she pleaded softly, "Come on, Kela, let's go." I swatted her hand away without even glancing at her. My gaze was locked on Seth as I took a bold step closer. "If dying in your hands is my fate," I said, my voice unwavering, "so be it. But only after I see Damien, your king." Seth's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding audibly. "Everything that has happened to him is because of you," he snarled. "Ever since he brought you here, everything has been falling apart. Everything is changing, and not for the better." My teeth clenched in equal defiance as I fired back. "I never told him to bring me here, Seth. In fact, I was living peacefully in my own world. I didn't ask for this, and I sure as hell didn't want to be dragged into this creepy world. So tell me, how is any of this my fault, huh?" Garby reached for my hand again, this time more desperate. "Kela, please!" I whipped my head around and glared at her, backing away as I snapped, "Get your hands off me! I'm talking to your father!" Garby froze, her face pale with a mixture of fear and frustration. Seth's growl deepened, his eyes narrowing as he took a threatening step toward me. But I stood my ground, bracing myself. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and added, "I saw the long black veins on his skin. I'm worried sick that something really bad is wrong with him. Just let me see him. Or at least tell me how he's doing." Seth's growl deepened, and he snapped, his voice laced with anger that felt directed at something beyond me. "He's not doing any good." His fists clenched at his sides, and his gaze grew distant, as though grappling with a torment he couldn't put into words. "And if I don't find a solution to bring him back?" He paused, raking a clawed hand through his hair, his expression clouded with fear, an emotion I hadn't expected to see on his face. Before I could stop myself, I blurted out, "Try my blood." Seth's head whipped toward me, his piercing eyes narrowing as he regarded me silently. The weight of his gaze made my stomach churn, but I refused to look away. His lips pressed into a thin line, his expression unreadable. "Your blood?" he finally said, his voice low and suspicious. "Are you saying this just because you want to see him?" I shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "That too," I admitted honestly. "But mainly, I want to offer my blood to help him wake up and possibly get rid of those black veins." Seth narrowed his eyes, his scrutinizing gaze lingering on me, as though searching for ulterior motives. His silence stretched long enough to make my heart pound harder in my chest. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll give it a try. But if it doesn't work, I will have to offer you, your blood, to my people." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I refused to show any sign of backing down, and instead I met his gaze with equal resolve. "If that's what it takes," I said, my voice quiet but steady, "then so be it." Seth stared at me, his eyes cold. For a moment the room was silent, save for the heavy beat of my heart in my chest. I held my ground, refusing to let his words rattle me. My mind was focused on one thing: Damien. If there was even the slightest chance my blood could help him, I wasn't going to back down. Finally, Seth broke the silence with a low grunt, his eyes flickering toward Garby. "You heard her. Get it," he muttered, his tone laced with reluctant agreement. He turned his attention back to me, his glare never leaving my face as if daring me to reconsider. "I hope for your sake this works, Kela. I'd hate to see what happens next if it doesn't. Garby returned a few moments later, holding a knife that looked like it hadn't been in use for years and a black bowl. The blade was worn and dark, the handle smooth with age. I glanced from the knife to Seth, my mind racing with questions I couldn't quite master into words. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and the weight of the situation pressed down harder than I ever expected. Seth noticed my gaze, his eyes narrowing in a cold, calculating manner as he reached out and took the knife from Garby. "Did you think I'd take you to the tower, Kela?" he said, his voice laced with a dark amusement. "Not under my ruling." He grabbed my wrist with a force that made my breath catch. His fingers dug into my skin as he yanked my hand toward him, holding it up. I glanced at Garby, whose expression flickered with fear, and saw her take the bowl in both hands, positioning it carefully beneath my arm. Her grip was tight, steady, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. "Control yourself, Garby," Seth growled, his tone a warning, "or I'll deal with you next." Garby's eyes widened, but she didn't argue, nodding quickly as she held the bowl in place. My heart pounded and my breath hitched as Seth turned his attention back to me, his grip tightening on my arm. Without another word, he pressed the edge of the knife, which I thought couldn't even slice a piece of bread, into my skin. The pain was immediate, a searing, fiery sensation that made my body tense. I bit down hard on my tongue, refusing to give him the satisfaction of hearing me cry out. My muscles trembled from the effort and I tasted blood, but I couldn't let him see how much it hurt. The knife sliced through me with ease, and I fought to keep my breathing steady, even as my vision blurred and the room seemed to spin. When he thought he'd taken enough, he released my arm. His eyes glinted with a twisted satisfaction, and his voice was low and threatening as he spoke. "Expect to experience worse pain than this once this fails, Kela." I didn't reply, my body still trembling from the pain. I could barely focus. Seth turned toward Garby, his voice colder than before. "Dress her arm before you lose control." Garby nodded quickly, though I saw the hesitation flicker in her eyes as she approached me, a cloth in hand. I couldn't even tell where she'd gotten it from, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered in that moment, except the lingering pain in my arm. And as for Seth, he had already disappeared without so much as a second glance. If I were honest with myself, I couldn't shake the question that gnawed at me. Why hadn't he taken me to Damien as he promised? My head spun, disoriented from the pain. Every inch of my body ached, a constant reminder of Seth's brutality. Garby gently sat me down, her hands working with careful precision as she wrapped a cloth around my arm. She didn't speak, but I could feel her gaze lingering on me, like she was trying to figure me out. I finally met her stare, offering a weak laugh. "What's with that look?" "I'm totally fine." "This kind of brutality isn't new to me," I said, though my voice faltered slightly. "It's something I've become familiar with over the years. I'll get through it. Today it's endurable because it's for a good cause." But as I spoke, I noticed her hand tremble slightly as tears streamed down her face. It was a strange, conflicting sight. Her tears, the sign of someone who cared, and yet she was the daughter of the very man who had just hurt me. I let out another laugh, but it quickly turned into a wince as pain shot through my body with every movement. "Are you crying because your father beat me up? Or are you actually worried for me? Or maybe, are you crying because I remind you of your old good friend you lost centuries ago?" Garby let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head. "Are you trying to be funny at a time like this?" She fell silent for a moment, and then, in a softer tone, continued, "Yes, I'm scared for you. I told you my father isn't a soft man. He's going to kill you if King Draven doesn't wake up." Her words stung, and I felt my chest tighten. But I reached up to touch the place on my neck where Damien's mark used to be, a small, confident smile playing at my lips. "He's going to wake up," I said firmly, looking at her with unwavering certainty. "I know that. I'm very certain of it." After what felt like an eternity of tense silence, Seth appeared again, his presence as sharp and commanding as a blade slicing through the air. I lifted my eyes to meet his, determination lacing my voice despite the throbbing pain in my body. "He woke up, didn't he?" I asked with certainty. My blood worked. Seth ignored my question, his expression unreadable as he crossed the room toward me. Without a word, he crouched down, grabbed my arm, and yanked me to my feet with effortless strength. His grip was firm and cold. "No," he said in a deadly calm tone that made my heart skip a beat. "It didn't. And as I told you, if it fails, I have to feed you to my people." For a moment, I stared at him, disbelief washing over me. How could it not work? My blood had helped Damien last night. The thought circled in my mind, desperate for answers. I opened my mouth to suggest that it might have worked better if the blood had been fresh, drawn directly in the moment, but I clamped it shut before the words escaped. I'd sound utterly ridiculous, and I knew it. Before I could collect my thoughts or formulate a defense, Seth moved in a blur. His hand fisted my clothing, lifting me as if I weighed nothing more than a sack of potatoes. The sudden motion left me breathless, and the icy rush of air against my skin sent shivers down my spine. The world around me became a whirlwind of freezing cold, my lungs straining to catch up as Seth moved with impossible speed. Just as abruptly, the motion stopped, and I was released without care. I hit the ground hard, the impact jarring every bone in my body. Groaning, I pushed myself up, my hands scraping against the rough surface as I struggled to regain my balance. Lifting my eyes, I braced myself, expecting to find the town's feeding hall, but the place Seth had brought me was far from what I imagined. The room was small and suffocating, the air heavy with an unnatural chill. Around me, 3 vampires loomed, their sharp eyes glowing with a primal hunger as their lips curled back, revealing glistening fangs. They licked their lips aggressively, their ravenous stares fixed on me like I was the most enticing feast they'd ever seen. A cold dread seeped into my veins, and I flinched instinctively, my mind racing. In a blur of motion, the first vampire lunged at me, its speed terrifyingly precise. Before I could react, its hands gripped me tightly, lifting me effortlessly until we were at eye level. A split second later, I felt the sharp, piercing pain of its fangs sinking deep into my skin. A strangled gasp escaped my lips, and a single tear rolled down my cheek, the agony radiating through my body like wildfire. The pain was all-consuming, tearing through every fiber of my being. My mind screamed for it to stop, but my body betrayed me, weak and unable to fight back. Just as I resigned myself to my fate, ready to give in to the darkness creeping in, I saw him, Ralph's wolf. Its fierce growl reverberated through my mind, even though no sound reached my ears. Its glowing red eyes burned with fury, its massive frame bristling with unbridled rage. More tears streamed down my face. I knew I must be dying to see Ralph's wolf so vividly, here in my final moments. As I began to surrender, allowing myself to fade into nothingness, a soft voice broke through the void. It was faint at first, but then clearer. Evan's. My son's sweet, innocent voice echoed like a lifeline through the darkness. "Mama." My eyes fluttered open weakly, the sound pulling me from the abyss. And there he was, my baby, standing before me. His tiny form was as vivid as a memory etched deep in my soul. His fluffy, long, curly hair framed his small face, and his glistening eyes shone with worry and love. For the first time since he was taken from me, I saw him, truly saw him, not in fleeting dreams or blurred visions, but right here in this moment. My heart swelled with an ache that was almost as painful as the fangs piercing my skin. Evan shook his head slowly, his lips moving, forming words I couldn't hear. It didn't matter. All I wanted was to reach for him, to hold him close and never let go. My trembling hand extended weakly toward him, desperate to feel the warmth of his small body in my arms again. "Evan," I whispered, the name barely escaping my lips as I clung to the hope that he might save me, even if only in spirit.
Damien's point of view.
Deirdre's soft laughter vibrated against my chest, a melody that soothed the storm inside me. "You're holding me so tightly, Damien," she murmured, her voice tinged with gentle humor. "Are you sure you're okay?" I pulled back just enough to look at her, searching her face for any trace of deception, any sign that this was another cruel trick of the throne or my own fractured mind. But there was none. Her eyes held nothing but love, and warmth. I don't want to let go, I admitted, my voice raw. Not after what I've been through. I can't lose you again. Her expression softened, and she reached up to brush her fingers along my jawline, her touch feather-light. You'll never lose me, my love. I promised you that a long time ago, didn't I? She smiled, her thumb tracing the edge of my cheek. A mischievous glint lit up her gaze, and her lips curved into a teasing smirk. Did you forget who I am? She said, her tone a playful blend of mock offense and pride. I'm one of the most powerful witches the supernatural world has ever feared. I'm not exactly easy to kill, and dying doesn't come naturally to me either. So, my handsome hot husband, her voice dropped into a seductive lilt. Rest assured, you married a dangerous, unbreakable witch. I couldn't help the huff of laughter that escaped me at her words. It was so undeniably her. The confidence, the sharp wit, the unwavering strength. She tilted her head back slightly, studying me intently as her expression shifted to one of concern. Her brows knit together, and she leaned back just enough to meet my gaze directly. Why are you acting so weird this morning? She asked softly, her tone a mix of curiosity and worry. I didn't answer her with words. Instead, I slipped a hand behind her head, threading my fingers into her soft hair, and drew her closer. Before she could say another word, I crushed my lips to hers in a deep, consuming kiss. She gasped softly against my mouth, but didn't pull away. Her hands slid from my jaw to my shoulders, clutching me as if she were grounding herself. The kiss was everything I hadn't realized I was starving for. Fierce, raw, and filled with the emotions I couldn't put into words. When I finally pulled back, her cheeks were flushed, her lips slightly swollen, and her breathing uneven. Her eyes searched mine, wide and shimmering with unspoken questions. All right, now you're definitely acting strange, she murmured, her voice a mix of amusement and concern. What's going on, Draven? I rested my forehead against hers, my chest still heaving. I just needed to remind myself that you're real, that you're here. Her hands cradled my face, her thumbs brushing along my cheeks. I'm real, love. I'm here. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself to believe her. The warmth of her lips consumed me, and I couldn't stop myself. I pulled her tighter against me, feeling the softness of her body pressed against mine. I lifted her effortlessly, her legs wrapping around my waist, as if she belonged there. My lips crushed hers, and she responded with a fervor that matched my own. Desperation clawed at me, a hunger I couldn't contain, as though this kiss might be our last. I carried her to the bed, my mind clouded with nothing but the feel of her, the taste of her, the undeniable pull she had on me. I laid her down, my body blanketing hers, my lips never breaking from hers. My hand slid beneath her dress, tracing the heat of her skin. She was mine. Always had been. Always would be. Nothing could take her from me. Not fate. Not the gods themselves. But then it happened. A cold, unnatural chill slithered through the room, coiling around me like a vice. All right, my king, a voice whispered, sharp and chilling. You've had enough. Time to return to your duties. The words struck me like a blow, and I froze. My hand stilled against her skin, my breath caught in my throat. That voice. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to drown it out. I clung to the warmth beneath me. Her warmth. Her presence. She was real. She had to be real. But when I opened my eyes, the world beneath me shattered. It wasn't Deirdre beneath me, but Kela, her form flickering like a dying flame, fading into nothingness. The fresh taste of blood lingered on my lips, blood I knew too well as hers. I jerked back, stumbling off the bed. The dizziness hit me like a wave, my vision swimming as the room spun out of control. My legs gave way, and I hit the ground hard. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in the room anymore. The damp air filled my lungs, and I recognized the place immediately, the tower on the hills. My mind spiraled. What the hell had just happened? Deirdre had been there. I felt her, tasted her. But the blood, Keila's blood. The taste clung to my tongue like a curse, and the memory of her fading form haunted me. I clenched a fistful of my hair, frustration bubbling inside me. Moments ago, I'd been lost in the bliss of being with the woman I loved more than anything in this universe. I believed it was real. No, I wanted to believe it was real. That everything that has been happening was just a nightmare. Hell, I wished it was. Suddenly, Ralph's wolf appeared, and I almost rolled my eyes, intending to ignore it. But then it started howling, a sound laced with unmistakable fear. Narrowing my eyes, I studied the wolf. It looked agitated, restless, and the only person who could make it that unsettled was its mate, Kela. But something didn't add up. I didn't feel any strange pull or sense that Kela was in danger. Yet, as her fading image flashed through my mind, a chill raced down my spine. The wolf suddenly bolted, its form phasing through the walls. Seconds later, it reappeared, its glowing eyes locked on mine, as if pleading for help. I shot to my feet, a sinking feeling gripping my chest. This had to do with Kela. I was sure of it. A wave of dizziness hit me as I stood, nearly knocking me over, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Without wasting another second, I dashed into the air and to my house, where I found Barbara pacing anxiously, her face pale with worry. The moment she saw me, she let out a heavy sigh of relief. "Thank God you're okay. I was so worried," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Where is Kela?" I demanded, my tone sharp. Barbara's brows furrowed. "Didn't you see her?" "She left with Seth's daughter. She was worried sick about you." Her words hit me like a jolt of lightning. Without another word, I turned and sped toward the hills, straight to Seth's cabin. When I arrived, I found his daughter crumpled on the ground, her vacant stare suggesting she was lost in some daze. My presence went unnoticed until I spoke. "Where is Kela?" I demanded, my voice sharp and urgent. Her head snapped up, eyes wide with alarm. She scrambled to her feet as if jolted awake, but her silence only stoked the fire of my impatience. I noticed her hands trembling, though she was trying desperately to keep them still. Her pale face betrayed the fear she was holding back. "Where is Kela?" I repeated, my voice razor sharp, my eyes locked on hers. My father," she stammered, then took a shaky breath and steadied herself. "He took her to feed her blood to his people." My frown deepened. "What?" My voice was sharp, demanding. "Why? For what reason?" Her eyes darted to the ground, as if looking for the right words. I listened as she explained, and without waiting for the full story, my powers surged as I pushed myself forward, blurring through the air, following the faint, fading trace of Keilah's presence until I reached the place. I appeared in the room, and the sight hit me like a hammer. 3 vampires were crouched on the floor, retching blood, their faces contorted in agony. Seth stood frozen nearby, his expression torn between confusion and guilt. And then I saw her. Kela lay motionless on the ground, her skin pale and lifeless, with her mate's wolf beside her. He was licking her neck, but its tongue just went through, whimpering softly, his tail low in defeat. I froze for a moment, my chest tightening so hard I thought I'd shatter. Then Seth turned and saw me. His eyes widened, and he stumbled back a step. "You swore to me," I growled, my voice trembling with fury. I moved to Kela's side, dropping to my knees and gathering her limp form in my arms. "You promised me, Seth, that you'd protect her in my absence." My voice dropped lower, venomous and sharp. "And now you've killed her." Seth opened his mouth to speak, but I didn't wait. I sprinted out of the room, cradling Kela against my chest, as though my sheer wood could keep her alive. I burst into my house and straight to my room and gently laid her down on the bed. I pressed a hand to her chest, and relief flooded me when I felt the faint rhythm of her heart. She was alive, but barely. Her skin was cold, and the wounds on her neck looked deep, too deep. I forced myself to calm down, closing my eyes again to summon the energy for a healing spell. The familiar pull of magic coursed through me, but it felt darker this time, heavier. My voice was steady, commanding the energy to bind her wounds and restore her strength. A faint glow surrounded her, and I could feel the magic working, stitching her back together. When I opened my eyes, the wounds on her neck were gone, her features soft and peaceful. But then I saw it. My mark was still there, but something was wrong. Black veins snaked outward from it like tiny twisted roots. My stomach tightened. What the hell was that? My stomach twisted, but I pushed the thought aside. She was alive, and that was all that mattered for now. Exhaustion hit me like a wave. I slumped down on the bed next to her, my body heavy and unsteady. A sharp, draining sensation tugged at my core. I felt hollow, as though something vital was being siphoned from me. The wolf paced restlessly beside the bed, its now golden eyes flickering between Kela and me. "Sit your furry ass down," I muttered, my voice hoarse and low. "She's fine now." The wolf hesitated, but finally lay down beside the bed, resting its massive head on its paws, its gaze never leaving her. I closed my eyes briefly, trying to steady myself. The sharp pull of exhaustion still gnawed at me, but a prickle of awareness shot through my mind like a lightning bolt. Seth. My eyes snapped open, their natural hue giving way to a darker, furious abyss as rage flooded through me. He was here, inside my house. Before I could think, I moved. In a blink, I was downstairs, my body a blur of raw energy and fury. I slammed into him with all my weight, knocking him clean off his feet and into the wall. The force of the impact cracked the plaster, sending a shower of dust and debris to the floor. Seth groaned, his hands rising defensively. "Draven, wait, let me—" But I didn't wait. I had trusted him, always had, only to disappoint me. My only focus was ending him. I lunged forward, my hand closing around his throat. With a surge of fury, I hurled him across the room. He smashed into the staircase railing, the wood splintering into jagged shards as he crumpled, before quickly rising to his feet, his fangs gleaming like blades in the dim light. "Draven, stop!" Seth's voice cut through the tension, a mix of fear and desperation. "I didn't mean to almost kill her," I thundered, my voice reverberating like a storm, shaking the walls of the house. In a blur, I closed the gap between us and unleashed a brutal punch. My fist connected with his jaw, the crack echoing as his body flew back into another railing. The wood gave way, splinters cascading like deadly rain as he hit the ground with a groan. "You promised me you wouldn't touch her," I growled, each word laced with venom as I advanced on him. "You promised not to make this harder for me, Seth. I trusted you." Seth sprang from the rubble, his movements quicker now, desperate, but I was faster. My hand shot out, catching his wrist mid-swing. With a sharp twist, I wrenched it, forcing a snarl of pain from his lips. He retaliated, driving his knee into my ribs with brutal force. A sharp burst of pain tore through me, but I didn't falter. If anything, it only stoked the fire raging inside, fueling my resolve. I tightened my grip on his wrist, the bones grinding audibly beneath my hold. His guttural snarl deepened as he lashed out, claws swiping toward my face. I dodged swiftly, twisting his arm further until his knees buckled, forcing him down. I looked at him through the haze of contained rage, the barely restrained urge to rip his head from his shoulders, threatening to consume me. But he was my man, not just any man, but someone I loved and cared for. That fact only made the betrayal cut deeper. Of all people, Seth should have understood me. He should have known better. I had explained everything to him about Kela. Yet, he'd gone behind my back and nearly gotten her killed. The frustration boiled over, and with a growl that echoed through the room, I hauled him off the ground and hurled him across the house. He collided with a cabinet, the wood splintering on impact. I didn't care. I crossed the room, grabbed a fistful of his hair, and yanked his head up to meet my gaze. "Leave my house," I hissed, my voice low and icy. I didn't wait for a response, turning sharply and heading toward the stairs. I did it because I was scared. Seth's voice stopped me mid-step. I turned slowly to face him. He was on his feet now, his shoulders slumped, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "I saw you turning into the old one," he said, his voice cracking. "You were becoming him again. The king. The dark monarch." His eyes pleaded with me as he took a cautious step forward. "I was desperate to save you, to bring you back." "That's not an excuse for almost killing her," I said, my voice sharp as a blade. Seth gritted his teeth, his jaw tight with frustration. "My apology, my king," he said, bowing his head slightly. I opened my mouth to order him to leave, the command ready to rip from my throat. But before I could speak, Keila's voice drifted from the top of the stairs. "Damien," she called softly, her voice laced with both weariness and concern, like she couldn't believe her eyes. "Damien," Kela called again, her voice louder this time, filled with urgency. She began rushing down the stairs, her movements hurried, almost frantic, her bare feet barely catching each step in her haste. And in her haste, her foot caught on the edge of a step, and she stumbled forward with a sharp gasp. In an instant, I moved. The world seemed to blur as I closed the distance, catching her in my arms before she could hit the ground. Kela looked up at me, her wide eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, she simply stared, disbelief mixed with relief flickering across her face. Slowly, her hands came up to my face, her fingers brushing gently against my skin as if confirming that I was real. She turned my face from side to side, examining me with the kind of care that made my breath hitch. Then her lips spread into a wide, radiant smile, her eyes gleaming with joy. "It's really you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I knew you'd wake up." I stood frozen, my gaze fixed on her. In that moment, the rush of emotion in me wasn't because my heart was pounding. It couldn't be. I was a vampire, and hearts weren't part of what I was anymore. But something inside me stirred, a feeling almost foreign, a heat that was impossible to ignore. Kela patted my chest, her expression eager. "Put me down, Damien. I have something to show you." I lowered her slowly, frowning, a mix of curiosity and skepticism swirling inside me. What could she possibly have to show me that she thought would interest me right now? With a glint in her eyes, Kela pulled her shirt down slightly, revealing my mark on her skin. Her smile was wide, almost like she had just achieved something monumental. "Look," she said, her voice excited. "The mark is back." I froze, my gaze locking onto the small bite mark that had begun to gnaw at my nerves, its black-rooted veins spreading like an ominous shadow. Kela sighed with relief, her hand coming up to touch the mark gently. "Thank God," she muttered, her voice soft. I was scared it was gone forever. I stared at her, a sense of confusion bubbling inside me. What I was feeling, was it pride? Was it satisfaction? There was something stirring inside me that I couldn't explain. Kela noticed my silence and paused, her smile slowly fading as she studied me. "What?" she asked, a hint of worry creeping into her voice. "Did I say something bad?" I blinked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "I thought you never wanted that mark," I said, the words sounding harsher than I intended. "I remember you begging me to get it removed. But now, you look like you cannot breathe without it." Kela blinked, caught off guard. She opened her mouth to speak, but then faltered, her cheeks flushing slightly. She started to stammer, her eyes darting away from mine, her gaze darting around the room, and suddenly, she gasped. "What happened?" she asked, her voice edged with sharp concern. "Are we under attack? Where's Barbara? Is she okay? I hope those greedy, bloodthirsty vampires didn't kidnap her." I watched her move around, calling Barbara's name as she hurried toward the mess of the room, her focus shifting from me to the chaos around her. It wasn't until she froze that I realized what had stopped her. "Seth." She halted, her body stiffening, and I saw her take a small, hesitant step back. Her reaction was immediate and telling. She'd been deeply affected by his presence, and I could feel the tension in her every movement. The pain, the mistrust, all of it surfaced in that single moment. I stared at her, then at Seth, and the realization hit me hard. The damage Seth had done wasn't just physical. Barbara's soft voice floated from the kitchen, and Kela's eyes immediately darted toward the sound. As soon as she spotted her emerging from under the island, she rushed to her side, her concern evident in every step. "Barbara!" Kela exclaimed, breathless. "Are you okay?" Barbara gave a small smile, though it was laced with uncertainty. "I'm fine, just a little rattled." I turned to Seth. "Leave. She and Kela are heading to the human world now." Seth opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off, my voice low but firm. "Let's talk when I'm back, when I'm very calm. I need to find that motherfucking witch and close that fucking portal. Until then, I don't want to see your face." Seth bowed his head slightly, and in a flash, he was gone. I turned back to the women, my eyes scanning them both. "Change into warm clothes before we leave." They moved quickly, and once they were ready, I grabbed what I needed and placed one arm around each of them. Without another word, I dashed through the night air, the cold wind whipping around us as we traveled toward the dark tunnel. When we reached, I gently set them down. Barbara staggered backward, but Kela was quick to catch her. I don't know if I'll ever get used to this kind of transportation, Barbara muttered, catching her breath. Kela laughed softly. It's crazy, right? Barbara laughed too, shaking her head. Don't say it. You'll have me believing I'm losing my mind. I led them inside, moving swiftly as I opened the portal. Go through, I said to them, my voice urging. Kela paused before stepping through and looked back at me. What about Ralph's wolf? She asked, concern in her eyes. I glanced at her, a small frown forming. What about it? We need to take it with us, she replied urgently. It has to reunite with its owner. I'm sure Ralph is looking for his wolf, and will forever search for it, because he has no idea his wolf is here. I let out a long sigh, my frustration growing. Fine, I said reluctantly, turning to Barbara. You go ahead, the car's waiting for you. It'll drive you to your home address. Barbara smiled and nodded. Thank you, King Draven. She turned to Kela. Hope to meet you again, Kela. Kela returned her smile and nodded in acknowledgement. Once Barbara disappeared through the portal and made sure she reached the other end, I closed the portal and turned back to Kela, scooped her up into my arms without warning, and dashed back to the house. When we arrived, I set her down, my eyes immediately scanning the area. The damn wolf was seated on its haunches, relaxed, as if this whole situation was no big deal. It irritated me to no end that I had to come back for it. Damien, do you see the wolf? She asked quickly. I didn't answer right away, watching the fucking thing with narrowed eyes. Yes, I finally replied, my tone strained. But it's hesitating. It's like holding back, refusing to go to the human world.
Seth's point of view.
The air felt thick with rage as I leapt through the night, the weight of Draven's anger hanging over me like a suffocating smoke. I could still feel the burn in my throat from where his hands had gripped me. King Draven had never looked at me that way before, never with such ferocity. I had seen him angry over the years, but this was different. It was like he was seeing me as a stranger, someone who betrayed him, who threatened what was most precious to him. And it was all because of her. Keilah, that damn human girl. She had become a thorn in my side, and my patience had finally snapped. I could feel the burn of my fangs, the ache to feed, to rip into something, anything to calm the fire within me. I pushed my speed harder, my surroundings blurring around me, until I reached the edge of the mountains, where the wild creatures roamed freely. Without hesitation, I launched myself into the woods, the familiar rush of bloodlust flooding my senses. My eyes narrowed as I caught the scent of something large and wild, something I could sink my teeth into. A bear. It was alone, unaware of my approach. I pounced, sinking my fangs deep into the bear's thick, furry hide. It let out a roar of surprise and pain, but I was relentless. I drank greedily, feeling the warmth of its blood fill me as it struggled beneath me. My grip tightened, and the creature went limp, collapsing under my weight. I let it fall to the ground, but my anger didn't subside. A guttural growl ripped from my throat, loud enough to shake the trees and send a flock of birds scattering into the sky. My body trembled with the intensity of my frustration. I turned away from the carcass, my eyes flashing as I disappeared back into the night and towards the blood niche. The moment I stepped into the blood niche room, the scene before me was grotesque. Vampires who had drunk Keilah's blood were sprawled out on the floor, their bodies lifeless, their faces contorted in agony. Frustration surged through me as I raked a hand through my hair, the tension in my muscles only deepening. I dropped to my haunches, my teeth grinding as I examined the pool of blood that still lingered. I reached out, almost against my will, and pressed my index finger into the coagulated mass. When I lifted it to my face, I felt my stomach churn. The blood had turned sickly, a rancid shade of green that burned my senses, and I could feel my own body recoiling from it. "That bitch's blood is poison to vampires," I muttered under my breath, the words tasting like acid. "It kills us." My thoughts flickered to Draven, his furious eyes, the way he'd refused to listen to me earlier. Too angry to even give me a chance to explain. He'd become consumed with anger, consumed with what he thought was betrayal, consumed by her presence, and now I wondered if it was more than just his usual obsession. Could it be her blood? The very essence of that human girl was altering him in ways we couldn't understand? I stood up abruptly, the weight of my realization pressing down on me. Could this human's blood be the reason Draven wanted to change? Was it her blood that was slowly poisoning him, making him crave his old self, the dangerous monarch? The more he spent time with her, the more he would feed on her, and the more that blood would seep into him, into his very core. I couldn't allow that to happen. I had to stop it before it was too late. Before King Draven lost himself entirely to whatever twisted influence she had over him. Without another thought, I turned and dashed out of the blood niche room, my feet pounding against the ground as I headed toward Draven's house. I needed to speak to him, even if it meant facing his wrath, his refusal to even see my face. I had to make him understand, but when I arrived, my heart sank. The house was empty. No trace of him or that human girl. They were already gone. Damn it! I cursed aloud, pacing in frustration. What was I going to do now? As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A familiar figure sitting quietly at the base of the stairs, its paws tucked beneath it. The sight stopped me dead in my tracks. What is that thing still doing here? I wondered, a surge of irritation bubbling up inside me. The wolf's eyes locked onto mine, and the moment it saw me, its gaze turned a furious shade of red. In a flash, it lunged toward me, its deadly snarl cutting through the air like a blade. I braced myself, claws and fangs bared, ready to fight, but to my surprise, the wolf passed straight through me, its form a mere shadow. I stood still, my irritation mounting. Why the hell didn't I think about that? The wolf circled back, and I couldn't help but growl, the sound low and menacing in my chest. "You're a fucking spirit," I snapped, my voice sharp with frustration. "I know you're pissed about what I did to that girl, but you can't do anything to me. If you really want to kill me, just get the hell out of here and go back to your other half, dog." Grumbling under my breath, I dashed back toward my cabin house at the hills, intent on getting my mind back on track. When I arrived, I found my daughter, Garby, pacing around, clearly agitated. Her head snapped up when she saw me, her eyes wide with surprise. "Dad?" she exclaimed. "You're still whole?" I raised an eyebrow, a wry smile curling at my lips. "What did you think would happen to me?" Garby paused, biting her lip. "King Draven was here," she admitted, her voice tinged with guilt. "I ended up telling him everything." I waved her concern away, my tone dismissive. "Nothing happened. Now, just get me your friends. I've got a job for them." Garby shivered, her unease clear even without her saying a word. I noticed the slight tremor in her hands and the way her eyes darted to me as if she was trying to piece together my intentions. "I'm not killing them," I said, my voice steady but edged with impatience. "I just need them to go to the human world and keep an eye on that Kela woman. They're the only ones perfect for this job." Her eyes widened as if I'd just asked her to throw herself into a pit of fire. "But they've never been to that side. Where do you think they'll even start?" "That's why I'm sending them now," I replied, leaning back and crossing my arms. "King Draven can't have gone far. They'll pick up his scent and follow it. From there, they'll find a way to blend in. Their mission is to get between him and the human." She hesitated, her lip trembling slightly before she asked, "Then send me with them. I can—" "No." The word shot out of me like a whip, very sharp. Her eyes widened further, and I could see the protest forming on her lips. I didn't give her the chance. "You're not going, Garby. Now go get them for me." Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment I thought she might argue, but instead, she nodded stiffly and turned, leaving the room in silence. As the door clicked shut, I exhaled slowly and made my way to my office, like as humans call it. I locked the door behind me, ensuring I wouldn't be disturbed. From a hidden compartment in my working table, I retrieved the strands of hair I'd taken, one belonging to Keilah, the other to King Draven. I placed them in the center of a stone bowl carved with ancient runes, the marks glowing faintly under the dim light of the room. Reaching for a vial of red powder, I let it cascade over the hairs. The moment the powder made contact, dark smoke began to rise, curling and twisting into unnatural shapes. The smell was sharp, acrid, like burnt metal and ash. I stared into the swirling haze, my jaw tightening as my guilt clawed at the back of my mind. "I'm sorry, my king," I muttered, my voice low and gravelly, "but I can't let anything happen between you and that human girl."
Keela's POV.
What do you mean by that? Why does it want to stay here? I asked, confused. Why would Ralph's wolf refuse to leave when Ralph himself might be searching for it? I sighed. Why do I even care about him reuniting with his wolf? But then again, his wolf is a part of him. He must feel incomplete without it. Helping him reunite with his wolf, it's the least I can do, right? I didn't catch what Damien was saying because I was too lost in my own thoughts. My focus snapped back when he brushed past me, heading upstairs. His eyes moved as if tracking something unseen, and I knew he was following Ralph's wolf. I followed him closely, noticing the tension in his jaw. He clearly wasn't thrilled about this, but he was doing it because I asked. When he reached my room, he stopped abruptly, his gaze narrowing at the wall. "What is it doing?" I asked, following his line of sight. "It disappeared through the wall," he replied. I stepped in front of him, my breath catching as I looked up. Holy moly, he's so tall. Everything you'd expect from a vampire. And hot, I admit reluctantly. Standing next to him, I felt like a doll. No wonder he carries me so effortlessly. Clearing my throat to shake off my thoughts, I asked, "Do you think it went to the human world?" Possibly, Damien replied curtly. Before I could say another word, I found myself in his arms. With a sudden burst of speed, he whipped us through the cold wind, moving faster than anything I'd ever experienced, even for a vampire like him. By the time he set me down, we were standing in a dark tunnel before a closed portal. Damien paused, staring intently at its surface. "The portal's been used," he said. "How do you know?" I asked. "Because its energy doesn't just vanish," he replied, his voice sharp and certain. He closed his eyes, murmuring something too faint for me to catch. Moments later, the portal shimmered to life, its surface rippling like liquid light. "Go on, Kela," he urged. I nodded, swallowing hard, and stepped into the glowing void. The sensation was instant and unsettling, like being swallowed whole. A wave of nausea churned in my stomach, leaving me queasy as I was pulled through. The world around me seemed to collapse and stretch at once, like being caught in a wave. The sensation wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. The air, if you could call it that, was thick with energy, crackling against my skin and sending shivers down my spine. I reached out instinctively, half expecting to feel something solid, but there was nothing. Just endless movement and light. It was disorienting, a sharp contrast to the smooth, controlled speed of being carried by Damien. With him, there was always a sense of purpose, a destination you could feel in the way he moved. But this felt chaotic, like stepping into the unknown with no promise of what waited on the other side. My stomach lurched again, and I clenched my fists, forcing myself to focus. One step forward, then another. The energy shifted, pressing against me like a tide, and I stumbled, gasping as I suddenly felt gravity return. And just like that, I was spit out into the hard ground. I swayed, my legs unsteady. I blinked, trying to orient myself, the swirling colors fading into a landscape that was eerily still. The air here was different, thicker, heavier. I could taste the sharp tang of ozone, like the aftermath of a lightning storm swirling around me. It clung to my skin, making every breath feel charged, as if the world itself was alive with energy. Just as soon as the feeling of disorientation faded, Damien was spat out of the portal as well, looking as composed as ever, as though this was just another ordinary day for him. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone cool and steady. I inhaled deeply, steadying myself. "Well," I muttered under my breath, "that's one hell of a ride." "Are we back in the human world?" I asked, still breathless. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Definitely," he answered simply, before starting to walk the opposite way. I hurried to catch up, my feet stumbling slightly as I tried to match his quick pace. "So," I panted, trying to push the ache from my legs. "Am I free now?" Damien didn't look back at me but spoke over his shoulder, his voice cool and smooth. "When have you ever been a prisoner?" I scoffed, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "Of course I was," I said with a chuckle, though it wasn't entirely funny. I had no freedom to do whatever I wanted. Isn't that the definition of being imprisoned? Damien didn't reply, just continued walking with that effortless speed of his, as if the idea of freedom or imprisonment wasn't something worth discussing. I was about to ask him something else when the sunlight hit me all at once. I stepped out from behind him, eyes squinting, and immediately shut them, shielding my face. "Fuck me," I cursed under my breath. The sunlight hit my skin like a slap, and the sudden brightness was overwhelming, a sharp contrast to the shadowy, dim world I was used to. I hadn't felt sunlight in, well, too long. I opened my eyes slowly, adjusting as best I could, but it was almost impossible. The light here was harsh, so different from the soft, dim atmosphere of the underworld. I blinked rapidly, the brightness still stinging, but eventually my eyes adjusted. Slowly, I opened them fully, the world around me coming into focus. The warmth of the sun kissed my skin, and a surge of emotion rushed through me. I couldn't help myself. I stretched my arms wide, tilting my face to the sky, and yelled, "Here I am, my world!" Drawing in a deep breath, I sniffed loudly, the scent of fresh air and sun-drenched earth filling my lungs. I murmured almost to myself. I miss the smell of the sun. The moment of euphoria was cut short by a voice. Someone was speaking to Damien. "Lord Seth sent us," the voice said, low and deferential. The name snapped me back to reality, my attention jerking toward the source. Standing nearby were several familiar faces. Garby's friends. Maureen, Hustle, Millie, Tasha, and Alan. I froze for a moment, caught between confusion and happiness. I rushed toward them, my steps quick and eager. "How are you guys here? Did Damien—" I stopped abruptly, glancing back at Damien. He stood a few steps behind me, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed on the group with unsettling intensity. I swallowed and tried again, my voice faltering slightly. "Did you—" I trailed off, but my words faltered as I remembered the name I'd just heard. "Lord Seth." "Of course." "Seth." Turning back to them, my excitement dimmed slightly. "What about Garby? Where is she?" None of them answered. Their heads were bowed low, avoiding my gaze entirely, as though Damien's presence had drained them of words. I glanced back at him again, uneasy at the heavy silence. Damien's voice cut through the air, cold and commanding. "What reason did Seth have for sending you here?" He stepped closer, his tone sharper, like a blade. "Tell me." The group flinched at his words but remained silent, their discomfort palpable. The weight of his question hung heavily in the air, and I couldn't help but feel the rising tension like a storm waiting to break. Alan finally broke the silence, his voice low and measured, his head still bowed. "He sent us to be of help to Kela, to protect her." Damien's jaw tightened as he raked a hand through his hair, the gesture making him look as though he was wrestling with disbelief. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his gaze burned into Alan like he was daring him to repeat the words. Before the tension could thicken any further, I stepped forward, cutting in. "Protect me," I repeated, my tone incredulous. "Why would you protect me? I don't need it." "I'm in the human world now. There's nothing here for me to fear, and I'm going back to my home. So, thanks, but no thanks." The group exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them dared to lift their heads to meet my eyes. I turned back to Damien, waiting for his response, though the weight of his unreadable expression only made my chest tighten. As Damien closed his eyes and raked a hand through his hair again, I knew the moment he opened them, he was going to snap. His jaw was locked, tension radiating off him in waves. I didn't need heightened senses to feel it. His anger was a palpable thing, curling in the air between us. And now, of all times, on human ground, his anger was the last thing I needed. I moved before I could second-guess myself, stepping in front of his broad figure. It was like standing before a wall, one I wasn't entirely sure wouldn't crumble and crush me if I pressed too hard. Damien, I started softly, forcing my voice to steady even as my heart pounded against my ribs. His eyes snapped open, and I felt the breath hitch in my throat. They weren't their usual ocean blue. They were darker, sharper, like embers burning in the shadow of an oncoming wildfire. I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to look away. This was Damien. He was terrifying, yes, but I knew him. Or at least I was starting to. Please, I said, my voice firmer now. Let them stay. His lips parted, and I braced myself for the sharp retort I could see building behind his clenched teeth. But he didn't speak right away. His gaze bore into mine, and for a moment, I felt like he was searching for something. Some hidden meaning, some angle I hadn't yet revealed. Why? He asked, his tone low and dangerous. Why should they stay? What purpose do they serve other than to waste space and time? Because they were sent to help, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. They're here to protect me, not that I need it, but that's their purpose. So let them do their job. Besides, I'm happy they're here. I finally get to spend time with them and show them what our world is like. And above all, they've been nothing but kind to me. I stepped closer, my head tilting up to meet his imposing height. Damien, I'm asking you. My voice softened, though the determination in it remained. Let them stay, for me. His expression shifted, the fire in his eyes flickering, though the anger didn't fade completely. His gaze lingered on me, heavy and searching, and for a moment, I thought he might refuse outright. But then, he exhaled sharply, the tension in his shoulders loosening just slightly. Fine, he ground out. His tone made it clear that this was more of a begrudging concession than actual agreement. Relief flooded me, but I didn't let it show too much. I simply nodded, stepping back to give him space, though the air between us still felt charged. The group behind me visibly relaxed, though they didn't dare say anything. I glanced over my shoulder at them, their uneasy postures making it clear they were just as nervous about Damien as I was. Thank you, I said quietly, turning my attention back to him. Damien's gaze lingered on me for another moment, the intensity in his eyes making my pulse quicken. Then he turned sharply, his movements as fluid and commanding as ever. The hum of the car engine filled the silence between us. Outside, the landscape rolled by in an endless blur, twisting roads, shadowed hills, and darkening skies that stretched on and on. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy with unspoken words and the weight of secrets neither of us wanted to touch yet. Damien sat in the driver's seat, his tall, broad frame looking perfectly at ease. One hand gripped the wheel with an easy firmness, the other resting against his knee. His face, illuminated faintly by the glow of the dashboard lights, was carved from stone. Sharp angles, impassive features, and those eyes. Even though they were fixed on the road, I knew they missed nothing. I shifted in my seat for what felt like the 100th time, unable to get comfortable. Ever since I got in the car with Damien, my neck burned with an irritating itch, a deep, stinging sensation that I couldn't ignore. I scratched at the spot absent-mindedly, fingers brushing over the mark. It wasn't the first time I'd felt this way, but it was the worst it had ever been, like a wound trying to heal, but constantly being ripped open again. I glanced at Damien out of the corner of my eye, but if he noticed my discomfort, he gave no sign. His focus remained unshakable, his expression unreadable. I sighed, trying to distract myself from the itch, but it was no use. The sensation crawled under my skin, a sharp, hot irritation that made it impossible to sit still. Damien, I finally spoke. my voice breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. He didn't look at me, but I saw the flicker of his eyes in my direction before they settled back on the road. What? You told me earlier that I can't leave your side. What did you mean by that? I asked. My tone edged with impatience. And where exactly are we heading now? For a moment, there was no response. The only sound was the rumble of the car and the rain that had begun to tap gently against the windshield. Then, finally, he spoke. Didn't I already explain? His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, a tautness, like a wire pulled too tight. No, I shot back, crossing my arms over my chest. You didn't. You just said I can't leave, but you didn't bother telling me why. Damien's jaw tightened, and I could see the tension ripple through him as he finally spoke. You're surrounded by dark magic, Kela, he said, his voice clipped and cold. It's from those council witches. I told you that before. I swallowed hard, trying to mask my frustration. Yes, you did, I admitted, my tone sharper than I intended. But I thought your decision to bring me back to the human world meant it was safe now. Was I wrong to trust that? His eyes darkened, and the weight of his stare sent a chill down my spine. It's not safe yet, he said, his voice softer now, but no less intense. But you resist the pull of their magic, and that happens with me by your side. Until we find a way to break this dark magic, you'll have to stay with me. No arguments, Kela. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words got stuck somewhere in my throat. How was I supposed to respond to that? Dark magic? I'm resisting it? None of it made sense, and yet Damien said it with such certainty that I couldn't bring myself to doubt him. All right, I get it. But where are we going now? I pressed. To find a witch. His tone made it clear he wasn't interested in further questions, but I didn't care. I wanted answers. A witch who helped the cast-outs open the portal to the human world. She's the only one who can tell me how to close it again. My brows furrowed. Close it? Why? He exhaled sharply. It's about keeping the outcast from crossing over. I fell silent, chewing on his words. The car sped through the empty roads, and the rain was now coming down harder. The rhythm of it against the windshield was oddly soothing, but the sting in my neck pulled me back every time I tried to relax. I shifted again, wincing as I scratched at the mark. This is driving me insane. What is? Damien asked, his tone distant. The mark. It's been itching and stinging the entire drive. That got his attention. His gaze darted toward me briefly, sharp and focused. The mark? Yes, I muttered, tugging at the collar of my shirt to show him. Your mark. Damien's eyes darkened, his knuckles turning white on the steering wheel. It's reacting. Reacting to what? I demanded, but he didn't answer. He just pressed the gas pedal harder, and the car surged forward, slicing through the downpour. Hours passed, the rain showing no sign of letting up. Damien had driven in near silence the entire time, stopping only once at a small, run-down gas station on the edges of some forgotten town. The sign had faded, its letters barely readable, and the building itself looked ready to collapse. He didn't say much when he got out, just muttered something about fuel. I stayed in the car, watching as he stood under the awning, his figure barely visible in the misty darkness. I glanced at the car behind us where Garby's friends were, their laughter and chatter faintly audible through the glass. I considered joining them or convincing two of them to ride with us in the back. But Damien had refused, his reasons a mystery to me. I sighed, settling back against the seat. He always looked so serious, like life itself was a burden he couldn't shrug off. Conversation with him felt pointless, almost impossible. And I was bored of the silence, bored of his brooding, and bored of feeling like a ghost sitting next to him. When he got back into the car, his expression was unreadable again, though I noticed the faint crease in his brow. He was worried about something. We drove for what felt like another eternity. The roads grew narrower, the forest closing in on either side of us like an unwelcoming presence. The rain heavied, the sound deafening as it pounded against the car. The landscape outside began to change. The shadowy hills and trees faded into the backdrop of something brighter. Buildings began to crop up on either side of the road, their shapes sharper and more defined as we approached the town. Neon signs glowed through the rain, flashing bright reds, yellows, and blues that reflected off the wet pavement like scattered shards of color. I let out a breath that I could finally get something to eat. We turned onto a crowded main street, alive with people despite the late hour and the pouring rain. Cars lined the roads and laughter drifted faintly through the air, muffled by the steady drumming of water. On the sidewalks, groups of people moved in and out of vibrant storefronts, some chatting animatedly, others huddled under umbrellas as they rushed to escape rain. The car slowed as Damien pulled up in front of an empty cafe. The soft glow from the inside contrasted with the dim, rain-soaked street, making it look oddly inviting despite its vacant air. He put the car in park but didn't get out immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out something small. I couldn't see what it was, but the serious look on his face told me it wasn't anything trivial. He stared at it for a moment, his brow furrowing as if the object held answers he couldn't quite grasp. Then, he darted his head around, scanning the surroundings with an almost paranoid sharpness. "I'm sure whatever you're looking for is important," I said, unable to hide the edge of impatience in my voice. "But can I get something to eat first? I'm starving." Damien's gaze shifted to me, his expression softening, barely. He gave me a curt nod, reaching for the door handle. "Go," he urged. I didn't need to be told twice. I pushed the door open, flinching as the cold rain hit me, and rushed toward the cafe. The door creaked softly as I pushed it open, stepping inside. The place was spotless, clean, organized, and strangely still. The tables and chairs were perfectly aligned, and the faint scent of green tea and fresh bread lingered in the air, but not a single customer was in sight. I frowned, brushing droplets of rain from my clothes. A cafe this spotless shouldn't be empty, especially in a town as busy as this one. "Here." Damien's voice startled me. I turned to see him holding out a MasterCard, his face unreadable. Before I could take it, he addressed Garby's friends, whom I for a bit forgot came with us. "Stay with her," Damien said. "I have somewhere to go." In perfect unison, they replied, "Of course, King Draven." Without throwing a glance, Damien turned and left, disappearing into the rain. I let out a small, breathless laugh. "Finally," I said, turning to the group with a grin. "I have you all to myself. But first, I need to recharge before we dive into any exciting conversations." The group smiled back, polite, but not exactly talkative, as I turned and headed toward the counter where snacks were displayed. My stomach grumbled, urging me to move faster, but I barely took a few steps forward before something slammed into me. Or rather, I slammed into it. It felt like slamming into a solid wall, though nothing was there. The invisible force threw me off balance, and I stumbled backwards, my arms flailing as I tried to steady myself. But before I could fall, Maureen's steady grip caught me, holding me upright. In an instant, the group surrounded me, forming a protective barrier as they shielded me from whatever invisible force had just struck. Suddenly, the lights flickered and then shut off entirely, plunging the cafe into complete darkness. The door slammed shut with a force that made my heart leap into my throat. I instinctively gripped Hustle's hand tightly, my fingers squeezing in panic, but then I felt it. Hustle's hand went stiff. I pulled back slightly, my breath caught in my throat, and turned to look at her. Her eyes were wide, fangs bared, and her entire body seemed frozen in place. I turned to others, one by one. They too were motionless, like they were frozen in place. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. What was happening? A low voice, smooth and commanding, cut through the darkness. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Turn on the lights. Let the human through." With a flicker, the lights blazed to life. My breath caught in my throat. Standing in front of me, just beyond the group, was a woman, a stunningly beautiful woman with pure white hair that flows down her back like a waterfall of snow. Her green eyes locked onto mine, sharp and unblinking, as if she could see right through me. I couldn't help but stare, transfixed by her otherworldly presence. She was unlike anyone I had ever seen before. Something about her felt ancient, powerful, and yet strangely familiar, like I had seen her in my dreams or nightmares. The woman's voice cut through the thick silence again, cold and deliberate. "Aren't you starving? Isn't that what got you where you're not supposed to be?" I stood there, utterly flabbergasted, my mind racing to catch up with her words. Shock, confusion, frustration, all of it churned within me. But what I was most aware of was the pounding of my heart and the irritation of Damien's mark. It itched, stinging in a way I couldn't ignore. The woman's eyes never left me, her gaze unwavering as she spoke again. "Come, get something to eat before I change my mind. As for your friends, they'll be fine that way." She motioned lazily toward the group who stood frozen. "Now, come." I stayed rooted to the spot, uncertain of what to do. The group surrounded me, still and stiff, their protective postures making it feel impossible to move without brushing against one of them. It was like they were keeping me trapped in place, yet I had no idea how to get out of this. The woman's expression remained unreadable, but her next words sent a chill crawling down my spine. "Get her here." Before I could even react, an invisible force grabbed me. It was like being yanked by a giant unseen hand, and I screamed in surprise as I was lifted off the ground. My body was carried across the room, the floor rushing beneath me as I was deposited directly in front of the counter, facing her. As soon as I was face to face with her, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. A wave of dizziness hit me, my head thumping painfully. My vision blurred for a second, but then something warm trickled from my nose. I reached up instinctively, my fingers brushing against my face, and froze when I felt the wetness. My hand came away and my eyes went wide as I saw the blood smeared across my fingers. It wasn't just a trickle. It was coming from my nose, staining my skin. I tilted my head back, trying to stop the bleeding, my breath catching in my throat. The room seemed to spin for a moment and my heart raced, fear gripping me like never before. Who in the world are you?" I stammered, my voice trembling as I tried to steady my breath. The woman's piercing green eyes seemed to glint with amusement, though her expression remained eerily calm. "You're a witch, aren't you?" I added. The blood kept flowing, and I couldn't stop my hands from trembling as I wiped at my face. My heart felt like it had stopped in my chest, the terror that surged through me palpable, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. The woman blew out a slow breath, and a misty plume escaped her lips, drifting toward me like a vaporous tendril. The moment it touched my skin, the throbbing in my head vanished as if it had never been there. My breathing steadied, and when I gingerly touched my nose, I found the bleeding had stopped completely. "Go sit," the woman said, her voice carrying an air of authority that left no room for questions. "I'll bring you something to eat." I didn't move immediately, my legs rooted to the spot. But then, as though compelled by an unseen force, my body turned, my feet carrying me toward a neat row of chairs near the window. It felt like I was being pulled by invisible strings, every step automatic and devoid of my own will. When I reached the chair, I sank into it, the sensation as foreign as the rest of this eerie encounter. My gaze drifted to my frozen friends, still standing stiffly where I'd left them. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught the woman moving toward me. She carried a plate of baked waffles, golden and steaming, and a ceramic cup of tea that sent tendrils of fragrant warmth curling through the air. The scent of honey and chamomile filled my nose, and my stomach growled loudly in protest, despite the tight knot of unease twisting in it. It felt surreal, sitting here like a hostage being offered their last meal before execution. My instincts screamed at me to get the hell out of there, but my body remained rooted, obeying the unseen pull that kept me here. The woman set the plate and cup down in front of me, her movements calm and deliberate. Then she settled into the chair directly across from me, folding her hands on the table. "Eat," she said simply, gesturing toward the food with a slight nod. I hesitated, but my hand betrayed me, reaching for the waffle without my consent. I felt the weight of her gaze as I tore off a piece and brought it to my mouth. It tasted heavenly, the perfect balance of crispy edges and fluffy insides, but the satisfaction of eating wasn't mine to claim. Even as I chewed, the sensation felt foreign, as if my body wasn't entirely my own. The tea was next. My hand wrapped around the warm ceramic mug, lifting it to my lips. The soothing heat slid down my throat, easing the lingering tension in my chest, but still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being a puppet. "What are you doing to me?" I finally managed to ask, my voice quiet and trembling. I placed the cup down, my fingers brushing the surface of the table, as if to remind myself I was still grounded in reality. Everything felt wrong, and yet I couldn't stop following her unspoken commands. I finished the last crumb of waffle and drained the remaining tea, my stomach now full and warm. Gratitude settled in, but it was tinged with an edge of dread. I prayed silently that this meal, as satisfying as it was, wouldn't come with consequences I couldn't handle. "Thank you for the food," I said cautiously, my voice steady but not without its tremor. The woman's green eyes hadn't wavered from me since she'd sat down, and now, under the weight of her gaze, I pushed forward. "Now, can you unfreeze my friends? We'll leave quietly and forget this ever happened." The woman tilted her head, finally shifting her attention to Garby's frozen friends, her expression darkening. "You can leave and pretend nothing happened," she said, her voice low and edged with venom. "But vampires don't." Her face changed as she continued, her lips curling into something between a sneer and disdain. "Look at them," she continued, her tone dripping with disdain, "baring their fangs, so greedy, so full of secrets and betrayals." I felt my stomach drop at her words, a chill cutting through me. Her gaze lingered on them with such hostility that I rushed to interject. "But my friends didn't do anything wrong," I said quickly, trying to soften her growing fury. "They were just trying to protect me." Her green eyes flicked back to me, and I felt like a moth caught in the glare of a predator. "Do you trust them?" she asked, her tone almost mocking. "Yes," I replied without hesitation. "They're good people." A mirthless smile played on her lips as she leaned back slightly, her gaze still locked on mine. "Just a bit of advice," she said softly, her tone carrying a weight that made the air feel heavier. "Never trust a vampire." She turned her gaze back to Garby's friends, her expression hardening further. "Not even those." Then her eyes moved to me and then dropped to my neck, this time in something more like disdain. "And certainly not that man." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. My hand instinctively flew to my neck, covering the mark left by Damien. My pulse quickened, each beat echoing in my ears. She couldn't mean Damien, could she? My heart thundered as her meaning sank in, and a nauseating sense of dread crept into my stomach. The woman stood abruptly, her presence commanding, as she addressed the unseen force in the room. "Get her and her so-called friends out." The door creaked open, and before I could react, I felt invisible hands grip me. I screamed as I was lifted into the air and hurled out into the pouring rain. I landed hard on the slick ground, the rain soaking me instantly as I struggled to sit up. Moments later, Garby's friends were hurled out after me, landing with heavy thuds. Thanks to their vampiric instincts and agility, they sprang to their feet almost instantly, moving with supernatural speed to form a protective circle around me. Alan's voice broke through, sounding utterly flabbergasted. "What? What the hell?" His bewilderment mirrored the faces of the others as they exchanged incredulous glances. I turned to face them, confusion knotting in my chest, but their stunned expressions made me pause. They weren't looking at me, their eyes were fixed on something behind me. Heart pounding, I twisted around to see what had them so shaken. My jaw dropped and a sharp gasp escaped me. The cafe, the very place I had just been sitting in, eating from, the same cafe we had all been unceremoniously thrown out of, was gone. Completely gone. In its place stood nothing but a blank solid wall, no door, no windows, no sign that the cafe had ever existed.